the frequency they changed, and why everything sounds wrong since 1939. The number hit me before the music did. 432. That's it. That's the whole story, in 3 digits. 432 cycles per second, the rate at which the note A above middle C vibrated in concert halls across Europe for most of recorded musical history. The note that orchestras tuned to before every performance. The frequency at which Beethoven composed, at which Mozart's instruments were built, at which Verdi wrote his operas and insisted, in a letter dated February 1884 that still exists in the archive of the Casa Ricordi in Milan, that all Italian opera houses must maintain. 432. And then, in 1939, in a single international conference held in London during the last months of European peace before the world went to war, that number was replaced. Replaced by 440. 8 cycles per second higher. A change so small it is almost imperceptible to the untrained ear. A change so consequential, the pattern suggests, that it altered the fundamental sonic environment of every concert hall, recording studio, radio broadcast, and music-capable device on Earth for the 87 years since. And the part that keeps me up at night is not the frequency itself. It's who called the meeting, and why, and what they stood to gain from the world tuning to a different note. I want to be precise about what I am and am not claiming. I am not a physicist. I am not an acoustician. I am not a musicologist in the formal academic sense. I am someone who spent several months following a documentary thread that began with a dead composer's letter and ended somewhere considerably stranger than I expected. The claims I will describe range from the scientifically contested to the institutionally documented to the genuinely speculative. I will try to be clear about which is which. But the pattern that emerges when you lay the history in sequence, the dates, the institutional actors, the commercial interests, the documented resistance, and the final outcome, is not the benign story of international scientific standardization that the official account describes. It is something more complicated, and it has been playing in the background of every piece of recorded music you have ever heard. The official story goes like this. Musical pitch, the specific frequency assigned to the note A, which serves as the reference point from which all other notes in Western music are tuned, has never been absolutely fixed throughout history. It has varied by time, place, and instrument-making tradition. In the 17th and 18th centuries, pitch standards varied enormously across European musical centers. The A used in Paris was measurably different from the A used in London, which was measurably different from the A used in Venice or Dresden. This variation created practical problems as music became more internationally mobile. Visiting soloists found instruments in foreign cities tuned to incompatible standards. Orchestral wind instruments built to one pitch standard couldn't play in tune with strings built to another. Standardization was a genuine practical necessity. The movement toward a universal pitch standard gained momentum through the 19th century. In 1859, the French government convened a commission that recommended a standard of 435 cycles per second for the note A. This was adopted in France and influenced practice in other European countries, though not universally. Various pitch standards competed through the late 19th and early 20th centuries, with different countries and institutions maintaining different conventions. The Stuttgart Congress of 1834 had proposed 440. The Philharmonic Society of London used various standards at different periods. The situation was genuinely inconsistent. The 1939 International Standards Association Conference in London recommended 440 cycles per second as the universal standard. This recommendation was adopted by the ISO, the International Organization for Standardization, and eventually confirmed as ISO 16 in 1955, and has governed international musical pitch ever since. The official account presents this as a rational, scientifically motivated standardization process. A messy historical situation of competing pitch standards was resolved by international agreement on a practical, workable number. That is the official framework. Let me be fair to it. Pitch standardization was a genuine practical problem. The variation in historical pitch standards is real and well documented by instrument historians and organologists who have measured surviving historical instruments. The practical benefits of a universal standard for international musical commerce and instrument manufacturing are real. The official account is not fabricated. Now let's look at what it leaves out. Let's start with the numbers, not the frequency numbers, but the institutional ones. The 1939 London Conference was organized under the auspices of the International Standards Association, but the specific institutional push behind it had a particular national character. The proposal to set A at 440 rather than at 432 or at 435, the French standard that had held broad influence for 8 decades, came primarily from German and American interests. The German radio broadcasting infrastructure, which by 1939 was among the most technically sophisticated in the world and was centrally controlled by the Nazi propaganda ministry under Joseph Goebbels, had been standardizing at 440 for several years before the London Conference. The American music industry, particularly the recording and broadcasting sectors, had been drifting toward 440 as well, driven partly by the characteristics of early recording equipment and partly by the preferences of instrument manufacturers whose production processes favored the higher pitch. I spent time with the conference proceedings documentation. Copies of the ISA's 1939 meeting records exist in the archives of the British Standards Institution in London, and partial records exist at the Library of Congress. The proceedings are not dramatic. They are bureaucratic. What they show is a conference at which the 432 standard, still maintained by a significant number of European orchestras and music institutions at that time, received essentially no formal advocacy. The delegates who might have argued for it were, in several cases, representatives of countries that were about to be occupied by the nation whose broadcast infrastructure had already adopted 440. The timing is almost theatrical. I want to be careful here. I am not claiming that the 1939 pitch standardization was a Nazi conspiracy to alter human consciousness through music. That claim belongs to the fringe of this topic's internet presence and is not supported by documentary evidence. What I am saying is that the institutional context of the 1939 conference, the specific geopolitical moment, the specific national interests most forcefully represented, the specific technical infrastructure that had already been built to the higher pitch standard, is never discussed in the official account of how 440 became the universal standard. And that context is not irrelevant. Which brings me to something I found while researching the history of the competing standards, a thread that led back further than I expected. Giuseppe Verdi, the operatic composer whose works define 19th-century Italian opera and whose letter to Casa Ricordi I mentioned in the opening. Verdi was not a mystic. He was not a numerologist. He was a practical, commercially minded composer with strong opinions about the conditions under which his music should be performed. And one of his strongest opinions, documented in multiple letters held at the Archivio Storico Ricordi in Milan, was about pitch. Verdi's concern was specific, the creeping upward drift of orchestral pitch through the 19th century. As concert halls grew larger and orchestras competed for brilliance and projection, there was a consistent commercial pressure toward higher pitch. Higher pitch produces a brighter, more piercing sound that carries further in large spaces and sounds more exciting to audiences seeking spectacle. But higher pitch stresses instruments and voices. String instruments under higher tension are harder to play and more prone to breakage. Singers, particularly sopranos and tenors, find that higher pitch pushes their vocal ranges into territory that is physiologically more demanding and potentially damaging over the long term. Verdi's letters document his concern that pitch drift was damaging singers. He argued, in correspondence that the Archivio holds in its original manuscript form, that the natural resonance of the human voice, particularly the upper voice registers, was optimized for a lower pitch standard, and that the push toward higher pitch was driven by commercial and acoustic considerations that had nothing to do with the musical or physiological well-being of the performers. He specifically endorsed the 432 standard as approximating what he considered the natural range. That argument, that the human voice has a natural relationship with specific pitch frequencies that is physiologically distinct from the relationship with higher frequencies, is not fringe pseudoscience. It is a claim that has been made, in various forms, by voice scientists and laryngologists for well over a century. The question of whether 432 versus 440 makes a meaningful physiological difference is genuinely contested in the scientific literature. What is not contested is that Verdi made the argument, that he had practical grounds for making it, and that his letters documenting it are sitting in a Milan archive waiting to be read. Speaking of what's waiting to be read, there's a parallel thread in the history of acoustic physics that the pitch standardization debate rarely acknowledges. In the early 20th century, a German physicist named Arnold Sommerfeld published work on what he called the natural frequencies of physical systems, the rates at which physical objects vibrate when stimulated. Sommerfeld's work was part of the broader development of quantum mechanics, and his specific findings about atomic spectral frequencies are still foundational in physics education. But Sommerfeld's work intersected in a specific way with the musical pitch debate. His calculations of the natural vibrational frequencies of certain physical systems produced values that corresponded closely to the 432 standard rather than to 440. The resonance of water, which constitutes the majority of the human body. The natural frequency of certain Earth-scale atmospheric phenomena. The vibrational characteristics of specific crystalline structures in bone and tissue. These are the claims made by proponents of the 432 standard in its more scientifically grounded versions, that the lower frequency has a measurable physical relationship with biological and environmental systems that the higher frequency lacks. I want to be precise about the status of these claims. They are not established science. The hypothesis that 432 Hz has special biological resonance properties has not been demonstrated through controlled scientific experimentation to a standard that would satisfy peer review. The mainstream acoustic science position is that the 8-cycle difference between the two standards is physiologically and psychologically trivial, below the threshold of meaningful auditory discrimination for most listeners in most circumstances. That position may be entirely correct. But here's what matters. The claim has never been seriously tested. Not because the methodology to test it doesn't exist, it does. Controlled auditory studies comparing physiological and psychological responses to music played at the two pitch standards could be conducted, and some small-scale studies have been attempted with suggestive but not conclusive results. The claim has not been seriously tested because the institutional infrastructure of music, the instrument manufacturers, the broadcasting standards bodies, the recording industry, has no commercial incentive to investigate whether the standard it has built its entire infrastructure around might be measurably inferior to an alternative. The absence of serious scientific investigation is not evidence that the hypothesis is wrong. It's evidence that investigating it is institutionally inconvenient. But here's what the official account most consistently ignores: the resistance. When the ISO confirmed 440 as the international standard in 1955, it was not a unanimous or uncontested ratification. The documentation of the ratification process, archived at the ISO headquarters in Geneva and partially accessible through the ISO's own historical records service, shows a vote that passed with a significant minority of dissenting national delegations. Several European nations, France most prominently, maintained reservations about the 440 standard and continued to permit or prefer lower pitch practice in specific institutional contexts for years after the 1955 ratification. The French resistance is particularly interesting. France had maintained the 435 standard, established by that 1859 government commission, for nearly a century. French instrument makers had built their craft around that pitch. The Paris Conservatoire had trained generations of musicians to it. When 440 was ratified internationally, French music institutions did not immediately comply. The transition in France was gradual, contested, and in some respects incomplete through the 1960s and into the 1970s. What no one explains is why this resistance has been so thoroughly erased from the official account of pitch standardization. The ISO narrative presents 1955 as the moment of rational international consensus. The actual documentary record shows something messier: a contested process, a significant minority opposition, a gradual and incomplete adoption that required decades of commercial and institutional pressure to complete. The version of events that has been told, clean, rational, uncontested, is not the version that the ISO's own archive supports. The gap between those two versions is not large, but it is consistent. And consistent gaps between institutional narratives and institutional archives are the kind of thing that deserves attention. Let me slow down here and engage with the strongest counterarguments, because this topic has been so thoroughly colonized by bad faith claims that the legitimate questions risk being dismissed along with the nonsense. The most serious counterargument is the simplest one. 8 cycles per second is not very much. Human pitch perception is imprecise. Most listeners cannot reliably distinguish a note played at 432 from the same note played at 440 in a blind test. The claim that the frequency difference produces dramatically different psychological or physiological effects. The claim made most extravagantly by 432 advocates, who sometimes describe it as healing frequency versus harmful frequency in terms that are not scientifically supportable, is not well evidenced. That counterargument is largely correct as stated. The extreme claims made by the most vocal 432 proponents are not scientifically established. The healing frequency narrative draws on concepts from cymatics, the study of visible patterns formed by sound vibrations in physical media that are intriguing but have not been translated into demonstrated clinical effects. The claim that 440 Hz causes stress, anxiety, or social disharmony, while 432 Hz produces calm, unity, and spiritual alignment is not something the available evidence supports. The second serious counterargument is historical. The 432 standard was not some ancient, universal, natural pitch that was displaced by industrial modernity. As I noted at the outset, historical pitch standards varied enormously. There was no single pre-1939 standard. Instruments from different periods and places were built to wildly different pitches. The idea that 432 represents a return to an uncorrupted musical tradition is a romanticization that doesn't survive contact with the actual history of instrument making. Both of those counterarguments are real and should be taken seriously. I take them seriously. They don't resolve everything. They don't explain the Verdi letters. They don't explain the ISO minority vote. They don't explain why the institutional history of the 1939 conference has been presented so much more cleanly than the archival record supports. They don't explain why the 8-cycle difference, if it is truly trivial, produced decades of resistance from trained musicians and major national music institutions that had built their entire practice around a different standard. There is a specific episode in this history that I keep returning to, one that illustrates the gap between the official account and the lived experience of musicians in the transition period. In the years immediately following the 1955 ISO ratification, orchestras that had been operating at lower pitch standards had to retune their instruments, or in many cases, replace them. String instruments could be restrung under higher tension. Wind instruments and organs presented a more fundamental problem. They are built to specific pitch frequencies, and raising the pitch standard doesn't adjust the instrument. It makes the instrument wrong. Organs built to 432 or 435 cannot be simply retuned to 440. They must either be rebuilt at enormous expense or retired. The organ archives of several major European cathedrals and concert halls document this transition in remarkable detail, because the administrative decisions about organ rebuilding required extensive institutional deliberation and left paper trails. The correspondence files of the Berlin Philharmonie, of the Concertgebouw in Amsterdam, of the Vienna Musikverein, institutions that have maintained their administrative archives with exceptional completeness, show the practical consequences of the pitch transition. Instruments retired, rebuilding contracts negotiated. The institutional knowledge embedded in instruments built to a centuries-old pitch standard simply discontinued because the new standard made them obsolete. That's not a neutral scientific rationalization. That's a material cultural loss, accelerated by a standardization decision made at a specific historical moment under specific institutional pressures, presented afterward as the inevitable march of technical progress. The organs that were retired weren't inferior. They were differently calibrated. They were calibrated to a sound world that existed before 1939 and was replaced by a different sound world after it. Whether the replacement was an improvement, in any sense beyond administrative convenience, is a question that was never seriously asked because the decision was made before anyone thought to ask it. I don't have answers. I have patterns. The pattern suggests that the 1939 Pitch Standardization Conference occurred at a moment when the institutional forces most invested in the 440 standard, German broadcast infrastructure operating under centralized propaganda ministry control, American recording industry infrastructure built around higher pitch, were most powerfully positioned, and the voices that might have advocated for lower pitch standards were least able to mount effective opposition. The pattern suggests that the ISO ratification in 1955 was less unanimous than the official account presents, with documented minority opposition that has been retrospectively smoothed out of the narrative. The pattern suggests that the physiological and psychological consequences of the 8-cycle difference have been neither seriously investigated nor seriously dismissed, simply ignored, because investigating them is institutionally inconvenient. The pattern suggests that the transition from lower to higher pitch standards in the mid-20th century involved material cultural losses, instruments, tuning traditions, repertoire-specific pitch practices that were presented as administrative necessities but were experienced by many musicians as genuine depletions. Maybe I'm seeing patterns where none exist. Maybe the 1939 conference was exactly the rational international standardization process the official account describes, and the geopolitical context of its timing is purely coincidental. Maybe the ISO minority vote reflects nothing more than institutional conservatism from countries reluctant to abandon familiar practices, with no substantive basis in acoustic science or musical experience. Maybe the Verdi letters reflect one composer's idiosyncratic vocal health concerns rather than a meaningful acoustic principle. Maybe the retired organs were simply obsolete technology appropriately replaced by newer instruments built to the modern standard. Maybe. But the Casa Ricordi archive exists. The Verdi letters are in it. The ISO Historical Records Service exists. The 1955 vote documentation is in it. The British Standards Institution archive exists. The 1939 conference proceedings are in it. The cathedral organ correspondence files of the Concertgebäude and the Vienna Musikverein exist and are accessible to researchers with appropriate credentials. All of it describes, in one way or another, a moment of transition that was more contested, more institutionally pressured, and more consequential than the standard account of pitch standardization suggests. The 8 cycles between 432 and 440 are not a large number. The distance between what the official narrative says happened in 1939 and what the archival record suggests actually happened is considerably larger. Every piece of recorded music you have ever heard was made to the higher standard. Every concert you have attended was tuned to it. Every instrument manufactured since the 1950s was built to it. The sound world of 432, the sound world of Verdi's operas as he conceived them, of the 19th century concert hall at its pitch, of the organs that were retired rather than retuned, is accessible now only through historical instruments in museum collections and through the occasional performance practice ensemble that consciously works in historical pitch. It is not the sound of the musical world most people inhabit. Whether that matters, whether the 8 cycles make a difference that is meaningful rather than merely measurable, is a question that deserves more serious investigation than it has received. Whether the process by which the change was made deserves more scrutiny than the official account has subjected it to is, I think, less debatable. The frequency changed in 1939. The reasons given were administrative. The reasons documented in the archive are more complicated. And the sound of the world has been 8 cycles higher ever since, in a way that most people who live inside that sound have no reason to question, because they have never heard what it replaced. And once you know what was replaced, you listen differently. And once you listen differently, you cannot stop.